Hello and welcome to the CS4 interview. Joining me this week is Paul Ormerod from Volterra Partners. He's going to be talking about how people make decisions in the 21st century. Paul, welcome.
Thanks very much. I'm pleased to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us.
Good.
So you started life as an undergraduate in Cambridge studying economics.
Yes.
And then you dabbled with the notion of going into doing a postgraduate degree and then entering economic research environments. Is that right?
At the time, Cambridge incredibly didn't have a formal postgraduate teaching course. So, but Oxford did. Oxford still has a very good one, a 2-year one. So I went there, where I initially specialised in economic theory, but I abandoned that and actually did econometrics instead. So,
okay. So why did you abandon that?
Well, at the time, this is looking back. At the time, the Cambridge faculty was that there were, if like very high-profile names who had world standing, who had a different view from the predominant view of equilibrium and optimization that dominates economics. That died away quite quickly. So by like the end of the 1980s, they'd all gone, or even by the early 80s. By the time they were there, so I had a different background, and the Oxford course was very much more about optimization, calculus models, which seem to me they have some insights, not completely wrong, but really not very interesting to understanding the essence of the Western economies, the market-oriented capitalist economies, is that they're dynamic, things change, the environment's always changing rapidly. So I was interested in understanding that. So the econometrics, in a sense, although it's highly mathematical, was like a refuge, something to do. And then I did start off, I did them for a number of years. I was at a research institute doing macroeconometric modelling and forecasting for 7 or 8 years after that.
Okay. So the work that you do, or the work you're going to be talking about today, would seem quite familiar to lots of people here because it seems to be an agent-based simulation model. It seems to be capturing a lot of the sorts of assumptions that we'd be very comfortable with. Yet at the same time, some of that work wouldn't be seen as being consistent with certain mainstream elements of economics. Is that right?
Yes, and I think economics, like I say, it's not completely wrong, and its great strength. It reflects a very fundamental feature of the world. And if I just use some jargon, that agents react to incentives. This means that agents, that's what we say, decision makers, could be individuals, could be firms. If the environment they're facing alters, their behaviour will change. And that's a very powerful insight, which it seems obvious, but there are other social sciences which really don't recognise that. So it's a very, very powerful insight. But then economics insists that they can only do this in a particular way. There's a particular way that agents have to behave. They have to, in a sense, optimise, subject to a variety of constraints. So there's only one behavioural rule in the whole of economics, which is optimisation subject to a variety of constraints, and that's how incentives operate. Now, you don't need optimisation in order to have incentives matter. It could be, agents may use heuristics, they may use simple rules of thumb. We may not be able to recognise the optimal decision even ex post. So most situations in the social and economic world, so complex that even after the event, we can't say whether a decision was optimal or not. So it mixes the two. So it's got a partial insight. It's not completely wrong. But it spoils it by insisting on a particular way in which people operate this rule.
So the thing they're optimising is money? Is it happiness?
It could be anything, right? It could, in principle, be anything. Now, firms optimise profits. That's easy because we can measure profits. But individuals optimise something called utility. Which is an amorphous concept. It could mean almost anything. And the utility function, and one of the problems is that it's not really capable of being, it's a theory which is not capable of being refuted, because you can always, in a sense, account for reality by adding more arguments to the utility function. You can just keep adding and adding and adding and adding. I mean, in its pure form, it's really a question, you face a set of relative prices, you have a set of tastes and preferences of goods and services, and given the price set, you maximise your utility subject to your income in its basic form, the way in which most students are taught.
Mm-hmm. So potentially there are as many utility functions as there are individuals?
Oh, there are all sorts. I mean, yes. I mean, utility functions could be all shapes. I mean, it's very hard to measure a utility. Nobody's actually seen a utility function.
We don't go around with it on top of our
No,
heads.
no. But in a sense, economics makes a series of postulates about what utility functions look like, and then derives some general models from that. Essentially, economics is a series of postulates about how individuals take decisions, how they gather information, and the rules that they use to process that information in order to arrive at their decisions. And I think this is an important point because most people perceive economists as disagreeing. You look in the media, television, economists pop up, have different views.
Yeah.
And that's certainly true. There are some very important issues on which economists disagree. So, for example, should the UK or Europe have an austerity programme? And there are different views. But in a sense, that's the tip of the iceberg, the disagreements. Below that, there's an enormous amount of agreement amongst economists, because fundamentally, it's not a theory about aggregate behaviour, like the big things, like output and employment. It's about how individuals take decisions. It's a theory of how individuals do this, and economists in general will agree with the basic postulates on that.
So these kind of postulates that relate to the rational behaviour, notions of optimisation of utility are fundamentally important.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, well, first of all, there's a key assumption that individuals operate in isolation. So I take my decisions. I have my tastes and preferences. Now, I mean, it's a scientific theory, so I'm not mocking it, because all theories make assumptions and simplifications. But it turns out now I have to have an ordered set of preferences, not merely amongst goods and services which exist now, but across everything that could conceivably exist. And these preferences are fixed. And I operate in isolation. I gather information, and a big advance in the last 30 or 40 years has been to allow for the fact that different agents may have different amounts of information, rather than assuming everybody has complete information. And subject to the information that I've got, in a sense, I compare my preferences to the actual attributes of the alternatives and choose the best one. So that's really the theory. Now, of course, I mean, one of the problems with it, this is one of the things I'll be emphasising today, is that increasingly the assumption that individuals act in isolation and that tastes and preferences are fixed is simply not true. Increasingly, so in economics, so people do affect each other. If I go out and buy a lot of bananas, for example, and the price goes up as a result, that will affect you because the prices have changed, but it's only very indirect. Now, what's not allowed in economic theory is I go out and buy bananas and you see that and your preferences change as a result. You think you've never liked bananas and you see me eating them and think, they actually look much better than I thought. I now like bananas. So that's not allowed. Because obviously once you do that, I mean, it's not impossible, but it makes using calculus very, very hard. Once you get these interacting agents, it makes getting analytical results extremely difficult. And that's one of the reasons it's never been allowed.
Okay, well, I'd certainly like to talk more about that, but just going back to the notion that we're not allowed to influence each other. So how would an economist model fashion trends?
Oh, well, I mean, they do allow for this. I mean, this is an important point. They can allow for this. So, for example, you could say, I mentioned earlier, that you could expand a utility function indefinitely. So you could say you derive utility from purchasing something that other people have already bought. But they are capable of modelling these, and they can model bubbles on stock markets, for example. But these are very much regarded as, if you like, special cases. The general one is, and it's not done by, in a way, just saying, well, allow for interacting agents and endogenous preferences. It's essentially done by adding arguments to the utility function, which is one way of doing it. But these are regarded as special cases, and the general one still remains that picture. Whereas increasingly, my view of the world just empirically is that it's the special case which is in fact the general one. So we need to switch it round. And so standard economic theory is not wrong, but it's increasingly a special case. And the example I often use is Marmite, where people have fixed tastes and preferences. You don't often find people suddenly deciding to like Marmite. Either you do or you don't.
Yeah.
So that's a very simple product. So there are circumstances when it's a good theory.
Okay, you mentioned empirical factors. So what evidence is there to support the postulates that people do, by and large, act independently rather than the contrary case where we are quite strongly affected? I mean, why do we assume that rather than the other case?
Well, I think that was. I mean, there's complicated reasons why these things were assumed. I suppose going back when economics started to first be formalised, and we can argue about the date, but let's just say 100 years ago, it's plus or minus. The only way of getting analytical results was, it was by using calculus, and so that was a very convenient assumption to make, that the agents are independent.
Yeah,
very convenient, and so that in a sense drove them in that direction. And it's actually quite interesting looking back at the history of economics that essentially up to like the mid-20th century there was this drive to formalise it, if you like, formalise optimising behaviour. But at the same time there's a very rich and very profound descriptive tradition in economics. There's a whole range of people, most of whom will be it's no point in mentioning many of them, but say Keynes for one, Hayek, who had different policy views for another, very major social scientists writing, and their work is very deep, it's very profound, but they lacked the analytical tools. It's certainly my view that these really great thinkers were actually were talking about complex systems, but they lacked the tools to formalise it.
Yeah.
And then there was a major landmark just after the Second World War when there was a book written by a guy called Samuelson, who was actually an outstandingly good economist, and he got the Nobel Prize, who formalised all this in a brilliant book. And then it became, in the subsequent decades, a bit of a fetish. So most economists no longer question it, rather than saying, well, this is part of what we do, and we also do this as well, because we know it's not always true. They've come to believe that the model actually is the world. And if the world isn't like that, they better well make it like that, which explains a lot of the regulatory activity that goes on.
If the facts don't fit the theory.
Yeah, so if firms don't behave like they should do in a regulated industry, better change, make sure that change them. So the theory, let's go to that.
So it's this kind of a constant frustration that the world doesn't behave as it should. It's not.
Well, I mean, it comes back to this point. It's that because this, and it is a very powerful insight, that when incentives change, and incentives can be very broadly defined. It just doesn't just have to be money. It could be status, for example. So that could be an incentive. To gain you get utility from status. This is why it's such a flexible concept, and why ultimately, it's not capable of being empirically refuted. So you might say some people might question philosophically whether this is actually a scientific theory at all. But we do know. The idea that agents react to incentives is just empirical. It's just clearly true, and it's obviously true. And by using that, they are able to account for quite a lot of what goes on in the world. And they don't really need all the paraphernalia of optimization.
Right. Okay.
Now, there are many people who've tried to operate outside that, or to say that it's not quite how economists describe it. Now, one of the bizarre things about economics is that many of these people have actually been awarded the Nobel Prize, and yet somehow their work is not absorbed into mainstream economic theory. There are some pushes and shoves, but it's not really there. So in fact, there's a guy who, he's a polymath, so people may well know him, a guy called Herb Simon, who was clearly a complete genius, who was never in the economics department. He wrote many things. He eventually got the Nobel Prize in economics. But he wrote just an outstandingly brilliant paper nearly 60 years ago now about this was the foundation of behavioural economics. And I mean, Simon's view essentially was it's only in very limited circumstances that the idea that agents could optimise made any sense. And he was a very keen chess player, so for example, he used the example of the game of chess, which actually, to describe, is very simple. There's only about a dozen rules. The purpose of the game is very simple. You operate with full information, essentially you have to see what your opponent's done. There's no disguised strategies. The rules don't change during the course of a game. And yet he points out, so for example, there might be positions in, after say 20 moves either side. It is not possible to say what the optimal move is. In most situations in chess, it is not possible, even after the event. So we might take some very famous positions in chess history, critical positions in world championship matches, which have been analysed for decades. And they've been analysed not just by the best humans in the world, but the best humans assisted by computers. And it's still not possible to say, even in positions from 50 or 60 years ago, what the best move was. You can rule out most moves, but even then, even after the event in a game like chess, now the real world is much more complicated than that. And for a very important reason is that the rules of chess remain fixed. Now, if you're running a business, they don't. Somebody could come along with a technological innovation which could wipe out your business. So the analogy is, a new piece comes on the board which moves completely different than anything you've ever had before, at random, without you being able to anticipate it. So the environment. So you can see why Simon was insistent that in fact people, really couldn't optimise. And what they did, they used heuristics, they used rules of thumb, which of course, because he did a lot of work in computer science, so it fits in very much with the complex systems view of the world, that we're looking for, fairly simple rules of behaviour, which people use as long as they give reasonably good results, and then only abandon them when they don't.
So that seems quite a sensible approach when you have a complex system, rather than try and zoom in on a tiny portion of the phase space to prove something about it. You might want to take a step back and take broader kind of qualitative sweeps and say it will behave like this here, it might behave like that. There may be transitions or kind of changes in its behaviour. So why would then one want to impose, out of all the kind of possible rules by which agents may behave, impose the single rule by which they necessarily optimise the utility?
Well, I think it's an interesting question, why that survives. And we can see why. I mean, there's a huge number of analytical results. Some of them are regarded, given the foundation, is actually very hard. So a lot of work being done on this. And in a sense, people have invested large amounts of their human capital in learning it, in developing it. So it's very hard to abandon it. I think it's one thing to say, well, look, if you go back, let's say, even 50 years, or certainly 80, 90 years, look, this is it, we can only do this. This is the only way we can make progress in formalising the subject. So if you like, you do what you can. And we know there's all this other stuff which we can't formalise. That's one thing to do that. It's nothing, as I said earlier, where it's now got to the point where people, as sort of graduate students, now socialised to believe that is the way people behave, rather than thinking it's just a tool for helping to think about the world. Now, what economists will say is, well, once you move away from optimisation, then you could have any rule, which I suppose you could say, well, then why bother have optimisation? That's merely one of a large class of rules that you could look at. It just happens to be one that a huge amount of work's been done on. But once you get to the idea that the environment's too complex to actually grasp, and so you're looking for heuristics to operate, and optimisation we could simply think of as another heuristic. And how much does it tell us about a particular situation? How much we might want different rules? And then they'll say, well, once you get away from optimisation, you could have almost any rule. Now, I don't think that's true. If you're trying to build an actual model of an actual situation, it's not true to say there are an infinite number of behavioural rules will actually explain the key features. So I must admit, I find it hard. They don't seem to be willing to use numerical techniques of solution. There seems to be some major psychological block to this. Whereas, in fact, you could think of these simply as, as economists would say, we substitute capital for labour in working something out. So you use a slide rule, rather than longhand. You use a calculator machine, you use a computer, and you use log tables. So if you want to solve partial differential equations, there are recognised computer techniques for getting numerical solutions, which are regarded as being just as valid. Now, it's nice to get analytical solutions, but it's not regarded as being somehow inferior if you can't. Now, economists have got some major psychological block with this, which I find baffling. It's not because they're not embracing technological advance. We couldn't do this sort of thing, a few decades ago. Now we can. Why not use it?
Is it perhaps grounded on some assumption that nature at some fundamental level is simple and elegant and beautiful, therefore our theories must reflect that, and they've got to have this kind of beautiful analytical component or feature?
Well, it could be. I mean, that in a sense they're looking for a general theory of behaviour. I mean, a lot of it goes back, this is a point that's frequently made, it goes back, it actually started to be first formalised towards the end of the 19th century, when, if you like, classical equilibrium physics had actually have made some real advances in understanding the world. And so it was copied to copy that. And it's ever since then that's the direction in which it's gone. And it's almost locked into this technology, if you like, and it finds it very hard to escape from it. Because, like I say, I keep saying it's not completely wrong. But it doesn't tell you about interesting things like how but it finds it very difficult to cope with change. If agents change their preferences, change their behaviours, if environment alters, which is the essence of a dynamic society, things alter. It finds it very hard to explain this, very hard to explain innovation, technical innovation. These are things that economics really struggles with, and they're very hard problems, but it's really not really got an answer to these, because it wants a fixed set of rules when people can perform optimization. Because it's fixated with the concepts of equilibrium. Now, so most economics is about saying, one equilibrium, something happens, here's the new equilibrium that emerges. Now, again, that's not necessarily wrong, but it tells you nothing about how long it takes to get there, or what the time path is. So it doesn't tell you, by definition, about behaviour out of equilibrium. Now, my view is most of the time, most situations in the social economic world are out of equilibrium. They may not be. Even if we concede, just for the sake of argument, that equilibria do exist, then in a sense that they're not terribly interesting. If most of the time you're some distance away, and you're moving, and in fact Simon describes this in his great 1955 paper. You're going along, then you're moving on one path, then something else happens before you get there. So that was relevant. It's not now.
So you mentioned equilibrium concepts from, let's say, statistical mechanics, which was just a tremendously powerful tool in understanding a whole range of physical systems. But no one would dispute that pretty much a very large number of things in the natural world that we're interested in are not equilibrium systems, really. I mean, if you squint and if you're careful, you construct your ensemble or whatever. So we need new tools like non-equilibrium statistical mechanics, which is fiendishly difficult mathematically, but fortunately, we have supercomputers now.
Yes.
So we can do a large amount of simulation. So do you see mainstream economics, or maybe some aspects of economics, increasingly embrace simulation techniques to look at non-equilibrium systems?
Well, I think the short answer to that is essentially they haven't so far. I mean, there is actually quite strong resistance to this. Even amongst groups of economists who would call themselves dissidents or heterodox, there's actually quite strong resistance to this sort of modelling. There's also ways which seem to me quite incomprehensible, because these are important technological advances, and it seems foolish to reject it. We might as well have a car and a chap with a red flag in front rather than driving at 70. I just can't understand why there is this resistance. Actually, there is one important point, which I think people from outside economics don't quite, especially the physicists coming into it. I've got a great regard for the physicists who come into this. I've worked with them now almost from the outset of the econophysics movement from the late 1990s. But they don't really pay enough regard to model validation. You know, so we say, well, okay, here's a variety of rules which might fit. How do we know whether we've got a good model? Now, the economists, whether this is scientifically true or not, they, as a community, they will agree whether a model's any good. So they will agree whether a model actually constitutes economics. Or if it's an econometric one estimated statistically, they'll have a set of criteria to judge, is this model valid or not? And if you like, the agent-based modelling community, which is very disparate, hasn't evolved a common set of rules. And so you can read you can read papers which look very interesting. I mean, I'm now caricaturing, this is not true, there are some very important insights. You can read a paper written by physicists about some social or economic phenomenon. There's the data which is plotted, and it's a sort of, on a log-log scale, it's sort of curved. And if you're trained in statistics, you look and say, that is not a power law, right? And then, but they'll fit a power law through part of the data and say, there's the power law, right?
Everything's about the power.
And then there'll be a really nice, really neat, a really sort of brilliant intellectual formational model which generates that power law. And so this model explains this. Now, I mean, it's a caricature, but it's one you will recognise. And so economists quite reason it. And economists are very heavily trained in statistics. I'll come on to that in a minute. So they'll look at that and say, I've actually seen this happen, and say, this is just, is this for general release? This is just bollocks. This model is not validated at all. Now, one of the reasons economists are trained is, I mean, maybe I'm sort of idealising physics, but you have your theory. Your experiments may be really hard to do, but once you've done them, in general, it's clear whether the theory is true or not. You don't sort of get your graph paper and look, well, maybe it is, maybe. So you don't need statistics in the way that social scientists do when they're doing that. But in social sciences, these things are very rarely so clear-cut. So you need to hypothesis test the whole thing that's grown, whether it's the Frequentist view or the Bayesian view. You just need to be able to do that. So economists are extensively trained in statistics, they have to be. And so when they look at some of the stuff that physicists do, they'll just be scornful because it doesn't, they can just look and see and say, well, that the statistics is just naive. The model, and they just don't then look at the model, which may be very sophisticated and very insightful, but they can, if they've got a good reason from their own point of view, not to look at it and say, this is not serious, because of, this is obviously not a power law.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point about model validation, because lots of physical systems, a lot of the power of physics comes from the ability that if you want to measure X, then you can make, hopefully you'll be able to make very precise measurements of X and then compare it with, hypothesis Y. Whereas for social systems, validating your model, I mean, it's fiendishly difficult.
Well, it's a very difficult problem, and I'm interested. I've written some papers on this, but I think not enough attention is paid by the agent-based modelling community working in social sciences or social science issues. What constitutes a valid model? It will never be as clear-cut as the physical sciences. And I think this is something that people coming from a natural science background fail to appreciate. It's a much more difficult problem. So, for example, the behavioural rules that you assign to agents. Now, how do we know? My view is what you should be looking at is evidence that these might be plausible. So you might refer, for example, to psychology, which actually, incidentally, does suggest in general that the economic definition of rationality, doesn't make much sense, but that's conveniently ignored. It's not a point just made by me, but Daniel Kahneman, who's now become very famous, a guy got the Nobel Prize, wrote his best-selling book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. He's a psychologist, and in his Nobel Prize lecture, he essentially dismisses the idea that I can't remember the exact phrase, I'm paraphrasing, but it's as strong as this, and says the economic concept of rationality from a psychological perspective is essentially absurd. Yet economists just quite happy to continue to do it. But so you'd look and see, have I got some evidence, some outside the model which I can And it's not a validation, but if I can't find anything to justify it, then I better not use those rules.
So we have over 70 PhD students here now, and we're going to get about 25 more come the next academic year. And quite a few of those are interested in the social sciences, modelling social systems with agent-based models, trying to understand economic systems. You've already given actually quite a lot of really useful advice, but is there like a take-home message that you'd want them to keep with them when it comes to, I want to understand some kind of socio-economic system, I think I might construct an agent-based model. Should they really be mindful from the get-go of how they're going to validate that model?
Well, if they could, that would be very important. That would be a big step forward. But the main message is that, the social sciences are not the natural sciences. They are different. They're called sciences, but they're still quite perfect. When you're building models in one, it is different from building them in the other. And I think it's important to try and actually engage with domain experts if you can, if they're going to be of any value to you. Obviously, there's no point going to an economist who just say, yes, we know how to do this, and write down a few equations. But an anthropologist or a criminologist or a sociologist. Now, this is where it gets very complex, because many of these disciplines, and not all of them, it's true, not everybody in these disciplines, but there may be resistance to formalisation in some of the social sciences. So in a sense, you've got two problems. Here's the economist saying, well, this is how we do it, and you go along and say, help, I want to do this, and they'll say, we don't believe in formalisms. So there's a bit of a tension. But yes, and I think concentrating on validation. How would I, if I had to get up and say in 5 minutes why my model is a good one, what would I say? What evidence will I bring to bear on this? What 4 or 5 points? And it's not just a question of saying this is a power law, my model generates a power law, which keep coming back to that. But it is now a bit sort of bit cliched, and it's not very persuasive when you've seen one, you've seen them all.
Yeah, we've certainly seen quite a few power laws in our time. Well, it's very gratifying you mentioned the importance of multidisciplinary work, because it's something that we try and foster, and that it's easy to say, it trips off the tongue, but actually getting people to, not just to formalism, but even just to talk to each other, trying to get different people from different disciplines to actually understand some central concepts to be able to effectively synthesize. It's certainly not something you get taught at university, right?
No, I agree, and I think one of the problems is from like the other social sciences is the idea of trying to produce a simple model, that you have to make simplifications to get anywhere, is not something which many of them feel comfortable with. So let's take an economist. Well, let's take Keynes. Most people have heard of Keynes, but I've actually read it. But very few people have actually read his General Theory, his great book. Now, this is an immensely rich book. It's just very profound. But how you actually formalise? Keynes himself never did, and he just wrote about it. So it'd be a very difficult task to actually try. Economists did, but they missed out most of the interesting bits. So you take the social sciences, and people say, well, you've got to have this and you've got to have that in, and they'll want a model which essentially becomes almost as complex as reality, which isn't a model. So it's trying to get them to realise all I want is just a few key things which drive it. I'm trying to synthesise that. So it's a difficult task.
As simple as possible, but no simpler.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes, yeah.
On that note, we have to stop now, because I think people are trying to come into the room for your talk. So thank you very much for coming again. That was great. Thank you.
Okay, good.